Hello and welcome to the third part of a series of videos that I'm doing on the subject of physically based shading. In this case, the goal here is material consistency, and one of the biggest things with making consistent materials and easy to author materials is a subject called energy conservation. Now, the amount of you who will probably have been terrified by that name, as this name is rather intimidating, it sounds ridiculously mathy, right? It's a really, really simple concept. It's just the idea that a surface cannot put off more light than it receives. This rule is not that hard to enforce, except that it actually has a bit of a weird quirk to it in the real world. You see, there's a very specific way that the real world has of dealing with energy conservation. You see, imagine for a second that we've got a particle, and I'm going to go back to my favorite little analogy of taking a very smooth lake and some stones. So let's say each stone is a light particle, and that means that it travels at the speed of light at all times. Now, if you're aware of what diffuse and reflective light are, reflection is when one of those light particles bounces off the surface it hits. And as we explained in the Fresnel effect video, this is more likely to happen at a grazing angle. And there's some math behind that. So, however, if it hits dead on, it's more likely to just bounce into the surface. Now, remember, light can't slow down, really. It can't. It can, however, bounce off of things. It can actually hit and bounce off and bounce around in a surface, and it can pop off, it can eventually emerge from the surface at some weird angle after having ricocheted a series of times. It's a bit like shooting a bullet into a bulletproof steel can. It's going to come off at some random angle. Imagine it was a bullet that would never slow down. It would be probably twisted by, ricocheting off a variety of things, and then eventually pop off at some random angle when it came out of the can. That's essentially what happens with diffuse surfaces, and this is what the diffuse node in Blender actually means. It means that you get this nice gradient lighting, and that's actually how the real world works. Over millions and millions of particles, it will kind of average out, and you'll end up getting some very, very good diffuse reflection, as it is referred to. However, there's a simple rule, which is that you can't have light particles just randomly duplicating, because, of course, it's a light particle. You can't really have one bullet go into this bulletproof steel can, and it just pop off two. You can't have two come out. The bullet would have just multiplied for no reason. That's not how the world works. So, as a result, one of the things that you can actually do with energy conservation is there's a simple rule to it, which is the more reflective an object is, the more likely it is to ricochet a bullet off, or in this case a light particle, the less likely it is that a particle or particle of light will go in, bounce around, and ricochet around inside the diffuse material a bunch, and eventually pop off at some random angle. Now, to be clear, if the surface is not resistant enough, and the light particle is allowed to bounce around far enough, it can actually be visible to the human eye. The difference in how long it was inside the material and how far it bounced around inside of it can be visible. We refer to this as subsurface scattering. But yeah, I mean, the diffuse node is the exact same as the subsurface scattering node, except that under the hood they're doing some optimizations. The diffuse node is technically significantly faster. But yeah, I mean, physically speaking, they're the same effect. They're the exact same effect. Now, let's talk about why energy conservation, what it does in the real world. The more reflective an object is, the less likely it is to diffuse the light that hits it. Because, of course, if the light, let's say it's a 50% chance of the light bouncing off. Well, if the light bounces off, it can't diffuse in. It can't bounce around inside because it already bounced off the side. Sort of the idea that if a bullet ricochets off of something, it can't also, at the same time, be blasting through it. In the same way that if you throw a rock at a lake, if it skates off the lake, it can't also dip into it. Unless you get into some crazy quantum mechanics, which we will not get into. So anyway, this is a little chart, courtesy of Marmoset. Both of these images are courtesy of Marmoset, and if you want to read some interesting information, I recommend PBR in Practice. It's a good little paper on it that actually explains things relatively well. Marmoset Toolbag is quite a cool little webpage to read about, and so on. Don't have a huge amount of experience with the actual program, but anyway, this is actually really not that hard to implement in Blender. The math behind it, again, is just the more reflective an object is, the less diffuse light it has. Because obviously, if light is bouncing off the edge, it cannot go into the surface, bounce around a bunch, and pop off at some random angle. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, just know that this is also why this will be really helpful in creating wet effects, for example, because, of course, the more reflective an object is, the less diffuse it has. And what this means is that when it rains, and water is rather reflective, the surface gets a lot darker and more reflective. But of course it's reflecting also dark things, so what you'll end up getting is that it looks overall much darker. That's how you get rainy effects, for example. Proper rainy effects. Now, of course, add some roughness into that and whatnot, and you've got yourself some very, very, very good-looking water. As you can see, I've done it with two nodes here, and I'll explain how these nodes work in a second. It's multiply and invert. So let me first of all explain multiply. Let's look at multiply for a second. Let's plug in our two values, our diffuse value, how likely it is to diffuse light, and how likely it is to reflect light, referred to as specular. Well, if I change my specular value here, notice the higher my specular value goes, the brighter our final color is. The more of this diffuse color comes through. If I make it white, you can see all of our diffuse color goes through. This is the opposite of what we want, because what it actually means is the more reflective it is, the more likely it is to diffuse light, which doesn't make any sense. That'd be like saying the more likely a rock is to skip off a lake, the more likely it also is to go into the lake, which doesn't really make any sense because, you know, it can't do both. And sadly, the computer is capable of this very, very easily. Matter of fact, I'm just going to show you, because it's terrible looking. You can see it just washes out your entire image. And you can see as I darken it, it gets darker and darker, which does not, while cool looking, is not necessarily correct. And once I make this white, you can see it gets very weird looking. If I make it all white, it just glows. So, and sorry for being stuffed up, by the way. I've been a little bit sick. It's rather cold where I am. So anyway, this is actually really simple to fix. We want, the way the multiply node works is that you feed it one color, and then you feed it a second color, which defines how bright any given component of it is. So for example, the brighter the color is going into it, the brighter the color is going into it, the more this color kind of survives the multiply node. The darker the value is, the dimmer the output color, if that makes sense. So anyway, a darker color 2 means a darker final color. This is the opposite of what we want, but it's the exact opposite of what we want. And we have an invert node. So for example, this, what invert will do is that it will flip your colors around. So for example, if I have a specular color of black, then an inverted version of that will be white. Pretty straightforward, right? Now remember our rules of our multiply. The brighter of an input value, the more of its first color will go through. The darker the value is, the darker the output. So anyway, basically, darker input, darker output. So, if we invert our value here, our reflectivity, this means the brighter our reflectivity is, the darker our diffuse becomes. The darker our reflectivity becomes, the more of the diffuse comes through. So for example, if I make my diffuse kind of an orangey red color, I can make it any color, and then as I increase my reflectivity, you can see that dims down. This is exactly what we want. And it's actually really straightforward. It's just an invert and multiply node, and this is actually physically correct. So if we go in here, you can see the more reflective, as I adjust it, it becomes correct. This will allow you to have stuff like rainy effects, and of course once we string all of these together in our nice little physically based shader, it'll all come together really nicely. Hope this was informative to some of you. I recommend, if you're interested in seeing the next parts in the series where we'll put together a physically based shader, subscribe, and if you like what I do, Yeah, anyway, have a great day. Make cool Blender things.